What if I told you that one of the greatest battles of the Middle Ages was won not by a fierce attack, but by an almost fanatical refusal to attack? In 1191, two military geniuses of their time met on the scorched coast of the Holy Land. King Richard, the Lionheart of England, and Saladin, Sultan of Egypt and Syria. This was not just another battle, but a clash between two worlds, two strategies, and two legendary leaders. At stake was not just victory, but control of the entire coast and possibly the fate of the Third Crusade. Saladin was confident that his thousand pricks tactic would wear down and destroy the invading army. Richard, on the other hand, staked everything on one thing: iron discipline. Watch the video to the end to find out how one man's endurance defeated the strategy of an entire army, and why this battle forever changed the balance of power in the Holy Land. I will reveal to you a secret that changes everything. The outcome of the Battle of Arsuf was not decided on the battlefield, but in the minds of its two main protagonists. This battle was first and foremost a duel between two outstanding personalities. On one side was Salah ad-Din, or Saladin, the unifier of the Islamic world, the man who recaptured Jerusalem. He was not just a warrior, but an experienced politician and strategist, known for his patience, generosity, and deep understanding of his opponent's psychology. His strength lay in the unity he brought to the scattered Muslim principalities and in the loyalty of his warriors. On the other side stood Richard, the warrior king who spent most of his life not on the throne in England, but in the saddle. He was a master of siege warfare, a brilliant tactician, and a man of incredible personal charisma. Soldiers followed him not only because of his crown, but because he shared all the hardships of the campaign with them and was always in the front lines. Richard was a pragmatist to the core. He understood that war in the East required completely different approaches than knightly tournaments in Europe. Saladin saw Richard as a worthy but predictable opponent. He expected the European knight to use typical tactics, a fierce but poorly organized cavalry attack. His entire strategy was based on provoking this impulse and luring the heavy knights into a trap where they could be surrounded and shot from a distance. He had done this before and was confident he could do it again. Richard, however, understood this plan perfectly well. He had studied his opponent's tactics and knew that in open, maneuverable combat, his heavy but slow army was doomed. His only chance was impenetrable defense and total control. He had no intention of playing by Saladin's rules. He was going to impose his own, turning his army into a slow-moving but deadly armored machine. Their previous confrontation during the Siege of Acre had shown that both were prepared for a long and grueling struggle. Richard arrived and broke the siege, which had lasted for years. Saladin, despite his defeat at Acre, retained his army and was ready to continue the fight. Now on the way to Jaffa, they were about to meet in open battle, and each was preparing his masterstroke. For Saladin, it was an opportunity to expel the Crusaders once and for all. For Richard, it was a chance to secure a foothold for further advancement toward his main goal, Jerusalem. He could not afford defeat, as it would mean the end of the entire campaign. Saladin also could not retreat, as it would undermine his authority as a defender of the faith. This conflict was not just a clash between two armies, but a clash between two philosophies of warfare. Saladin relied on mobility, knowledge of the terrain, and wearing down the enemy. Richard relied on heavy armor, the technological superiority of his weapons, such as crossbows, and, most importantly, the iron discipline he intended to instill in his knights. The confrontation between these two minds was a true intellectual duel. Richard was known for his quick temper and lion-like disposition, but on this campaign he showed incredible restraint. He understood that any order given on emotion would lead to disaster. He had to become not a lion but a rock. But Saladin, in turn, respected Richard. He saw him not just as an infidel, but as a great warrior. This mutual respect was unique for that time, but it did not negate the main task. Each of them had to outplay the other, and the field at Arsuf was to become a chessboard. Both leaders understood that their soldiers were watching them. The morale of the army depended entirely on the confidence that the commanders radiated. Richard personally patrolled the ranks, ensuring that orders were carried out. Saladin constantly moved between his troops, inspiring them. The battle of wits began long before the clash of steel. Richard and Saladin went down in history as noble adversaries. Do you think such mutual respect between enemies is possible in today's world? Share your opinion in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new great battles. Are you ready to learn the truth about what the Crusades really were? After capturing the rich port city of Acre, Richard faced a new, even more difficult task. His main goal remained Jerusalem, but going deeper into the territory without support would be suicidal. He needed a port that could serve as a supply base. Such a port was Jaffa, located further south along the coast. The route from Accra to Jaffa was a march of more than 100 kilometers along a narrow coastal strip. On one side was the sea, on the other were hills controlled by Saladin's forces. It was the perfect terrain for ambushes and guerrilla warfare, in which Saladin's warriors were unmatched masters. Richard was well aware of the danger of this undertaking. He could not allow his army to stretch out or succumb to panic. He devised a strict plan for the march. The entire army was divided into 12 interconnected units that moved in perfect order. It was not just a column, but a bristling fortress on the march. Discipline was paramount. Soldiers were strictly forbidden to leave the formation, either to pursue the enemy or to collect trophies. Anyone who violated the order was severely punished. Richard knew that Saladin would provoke his warriors, and only total control could save the army. One of Richard's key decisions was to use the fleet. While the army moved overland, the Crusader fleet accompanied it along the coast. It was a brilliant logistical move. The ships carried supplies, water, and, most importantly, provided rest for the wounded and weary. The army spent the night on the shore under the protection of the ships, which prevented Saladin from carrying out effective night attacks. Saladin, for his part, had no intention of giving the enemy an easy ride. He threw his best forces, mobile mounted archers, at Richard's army. Day after day, they circled around the marching column, showering it with a hail of arrows. Their goal was not to destroy the army in one blow, but to wear it down and drive it to despair. Every day became a test. The soldiers had to march under the scorching sun, in heavy armor, fending off continuous attacks. The heat was unbearable, and the constant tension was exhausting. Saladin's soldiers were everywhere, their shouts and the whistling of arrows never ceasing for a moment. Richard kept the army under his iron fist. He himself, along with his best knights, constantly moved along the column, maintaining order, inspiring the soldiers, and plugging gaps in the defense. His presence had a greater effect on the warriors than any orders. They saw that their king shared the danger with them. Despite all the precautions, the march was difficult. There were casualties every day, albeit small ones. But they were not from direct attacks, but from heat, fatigue, and constant stress. Saladin methodically bit off small pieces of Richard's army, hoping that in the end it would simply collapse from internal exhaustion. This march was a real test of Richard's leadership qualities and the strength of his army. They moved slowly, covering only a few kilometers a day, but they moved. Every step was a small victory. They learned to live under constant threat, transforming from scattered troops into a single, hardened organism. The Crusader army became a slowly creeping, bristling fortress. But what if I told you that the greatest threat to this fortress came not from outside, but from within? Read on to the next chapter to learn about the technology that made this army nearly invulnerable. What you are about to learn was a true technological and tactical marvel of the Middle Ages. To counter Saladin's tactics, Richard employed a unique formation that turned his army into an impenetrable, living fortress. It was not a simple gathering of warriors. It was a complex, well-thought-out mechanism where each element had its own vital function. It was not just a defense, but an active defense that wore down the enemy itself. The infantry formed the basis of this mechanism. On the land side, where the main threat came from, the infantry marched, mainly crossbowmen and spearmen. They formed an outer wall. The spearmen held out their long spears, creating an impenetrable forest that repelled attacks by light cavalry. Behind them were the crossbowmen. It was the crossbows that became one of the technological keys to success. The European crossbow of that time was a powerful weapon, superior in range and penetrating power to the composite bows of Saladin's warriors. Volley after volley of crossbow bolts inflicted significant damage on the attackers, forcing them to keep their distance. This was a technological advantage that Richard exploited to the full. Inside this protective perimeter, in relative safety, moved the heart of the army, the heavy knightly cavalry. These were the most elite warriors, the tanks of the Middle Ages. Their main task was to do nothing. They had to restrain their knightly impulse, their desire to rush into battle and simply wait for orders. This was the most difficult test for them. Richard himself understood that it was impossible to simply stand under fire. Therefore, he organized a rotation system. The infantrymen, who bore the brunt of the attacks, were regularly replaced. Fresh troops moved to the outer perimeter, while the tired ones went deeper into the column to rest. This allowed them to maintain a high level of combat readiness throughout the grueling day. Equipment played an equally important role. The warriors were protected by chainmail armor, which, although heavy and hot in the sun, provided good protection from arrows. Shields covering the warriors from head to toe created a solid wall against which enemy projectiles shattered. Chronicles of the time wrote that the backs of the Crusaders resembled pincushions because of the arrows sticking out of their shields and armor. This tactic was incredibly effective, but also incredibly exhausting. It required not personal valor from each warrior, but complete obedience to orders and trust in their neighbors' information. They could not see the overall picture of the battle. They could only see their small section of the defense. Their world narrowed to the order to hold the line. Saladin and his commanders were confused. Their usual tactics were not working. They showered the Crusaders with arrows but could not pierce their armor or break their formation. They tried to provoke the knights into attacking, but they did not give in. Richard's army crept forward like a giant armored hedgehog, and it was impossible to stop it. This living fortress was slow and cumbersome. It could not pursue a mobile enemy, but it had one main task: to reach its goal. And it accomplished that task. Every step forward was achieved at an incredible cost, but it was done. This tactic demonstrated Richard's genius as a commander. He did not play someone else's game. He created his own, in which his strengths, heavy armor, discipline, and the firepower of crossbows neutralized the enemy's strengths, such as mobility and numerical superiority. It was a new type of warfare. This unique formation was not just a military formation, but a psychological weapon. It demonstrated to Saladin the indomitable spirit of the Crusaders. They marched forward regardless, and that was frightening. An army that cannot be stopped is a formidable enemy. If you like this detailed analysis of equipment and tactics, let us know by liking this video. Guess what happened next when one army refused to fight at full strength and the other refused to retreat? The days of marching merged into one endless, exhausting nightmare. The hardest test was not even physical, but psychological. Imagine yourself in the place of a soldier in this column. From morning to night, you walk under the scorching sun in heavy armor, while the enemy constantly circles around you, never stopping. Saladin's warriors were masters of psychological warfare. They didn't just shoot their bows. They shouted, beat their drums, and blew their trumpets, creating a deafening, demoralizing noise. They appeared from behind the hills, feigned massive attacks, and then disappeared just as quickly, giving no moment of rest. Their goal was to break the enemy's will. For European knights raised on the idea of personal combat and glorious attack, this tactic was offensive. They had to stand and endure while arrows flew at them. They were forbidden to respond to challenges and rush at their attackers. It was a test of their pride, their honor, their very essence. Richard was forced to introduce draconian measures. He announced that anyone who left the formation without orders would be considered a traitor. He knew that if one knight gave in to impulse, others would follow, and the entire carefully constructed formation would collapse. This would lead to disaster, as had happened in previous battles. The tension within the column grew with each passing day. The soldiers were at their limit. They were exhausted, angry, and humiliated. It was especially hard for the knightly orders, the Templars and Hospitallers. They marched in the vanguard and rear guard, taking the heaviest blows. Their brothers fell beside them, and they could not even avenge them. The Hospitallers marching in the rearguard suffered the most. It was on them that Saladin focused his main attack, hoping to bite off the tail of the column. Every day, the master of the Hospitallers, Garnier de Nablus, begged Richard to allow a counterattack, and every day Richard refused. He waited. Richard was not just a warrior, he was a strategist. He understood that Saladin could not wage such a war forever. His army was not made of iron either. He waited for the moment when Saladin would come too close, when his soldiers would relax, believing in their impunity. He was preparing a single but devastating counterattack. But for this, he needed the entire army, as one man, to withstand the pressure. He risked everything. He put the loyalty and discipline of his men on the line. He demanded the impossible from them. Passive bravery, which was valued much less than bravery in attack. Saladin's soldiers, seeing that their attacks were not working and that the Crusaders were stubbornly continuing their advance, also began to lose patience. They came closer and closer, their attacks becoming more and more furious and less organized. They themselves fell into the psychological trap set by Richard. Saladin's plan to wear down his enemy backfired. His soldiers were tired of fruitless attacks. Richard's army, though suffering losses and on the verge of collapse, became more united and hardened by their shared misfortune with each passing day. They became a single fist. Richard demanded the impossible, endurance under constant pressure. But how long could the warriors hold out? In the next chapter, we will see how the tension reached its peak on the day of the decisive battle. By September 7, 1191, the Crusader army had reached the forest near the town of Arsuf. It was one of the last stages of the march before Jaffa. Saladin knew that this was his last chance to stop Richard in open country. The forest near Arsuf gave him the opportunity to hide his troops and launch a sudden massive attack. He decided to give a general battle. From dawn, the attacks resumed with unprecedented force. Saladin threw all his reserves into battle. These were not just skirmishes, but a full-scale assault on the marching column. Tens of thousands of warriors descended on Richard's army. The noise was unimaginable. Drums, trumpets, shouts, and the whistling of thousands of arrows. Richard, as always, remained calm. He gave the order to continue the march, maintaining formation. The army moved forward slowly, repelling one attack after another. The infantry and crossbowmen on the flank worked to the limit of their capabilities. Their shields were riddled with projectiles, but they held their ground. As in previous days, the fiercest onslaught fell on the rearguard, where the Knights Hospitaller were stationed. They suffered heavy losses. Their armor could no longer protect them from such a barrage. Saladin's warriors closed in, attacking in short skirmishes and then retreating immediately. The master of the Hospitaller, Garnier de Nablus, was in despair. He saw his best knights falling one after another. His pride and his military spirit could no longer bear it. He sent messengers to Richard again and again with the same request. "Let us attack." Richard responded with an icy refusal. His plan was to wait until Saladin's entire army was drawn into battle and lost its order. He waited for the perfect moment for a general counterattack. He ordered the Hospitallers to hold out until his personal signal. 6 trumpet blasts to be sounded simultaneously. But the tension was too great. Saladin's warriors, encouraged by the visible difficulties of the Hospitallers, intensified their attack. They came so close that their faces could already be seen. They showered the knights not only with arrows, but also with insults, provoking them to disobey orders. The Hospitallers were on the verge of mutiny. They were not cowards. They were the elite of knighthood. And the order to stand and endure was worse for them than any order to attack. They were ready to do anything to end this humiliating situation. Garnier de Nablus sent another messenger to the king. The answer was the same. "Hold on. Wait for the signal." The master was furious. He felt that Richard was sacrificing his order for some plan of his own that he did not understand. He could no longer watch his men suffer. At one point, one of Saladin's commanders, in a burst of bravery, broke through too close to the ranks of the Hospitallers. That was the last straw. The cup of patience was full. The spring that Richard had been holding down for weeks was ready to snap back with destructive force. Even the most loyal warriors have their limits. Human nature took its toll. The knights could no longer stand by passively. They craved action. They craved combat where they could use their skills. not just stand as targets. What if everything you had been taught about discipline was broken in an instant? In the heat of battle, when the pressure on the rearguard became unbearable, what Richard feared most happened. Two Knights Hospitaller, the Marshal of the Order, and a knight named Baldwin Le Caron, could not take it anymore. They could not or would not wait any longer. Without waiting for orders from their master, let alone the king, they turned their horses around and, with loud cries, rushed straight into the thick of the enemy. It was a direct violation of orders, an act of blatant insubordination. Richard's entire complex strategy, built on endurance, was collapsing at that moment. Seeing their comrades rush into the attack, the rest of the Hospitallers could not stand aside. It was like a chain reaction. The entire squad, thousands of heavily armed knights, turned as one and rushed after the first daredevils. Saladin's plan seemed to have worked. He had achieved his goal. He had provoked a premature, chaotic attack. Garnier de Nobles, master of the Hospitallers, realized that there was nothing he could do. His men were in battle. Instead of trying to stop them, he led the attack himself. He could not abandon his knights. The rearguard turned into an uncontrollable attacking avalanche. When the news reached Richard, he was faced with a choice that would determine the outcome not only of this battle, but of the entire campaign. He could allow the Hospitallers to die, punishing them for their disobedience. He could try to call them back, which was already impossible. Or he could do what only a genius is capable of. Richard realized that this was his only chance. Yes, the attack was premature. Yes, it was chaotic. But it had begun. Saladin's warriors, who had not expected such a sudden strike, were momentarily confused. Their formation, which was offensive, was not ready for defense. Instead of panicking or getting angry, Richard the Lionheart made a split-second decision. He realized that disaster had to be turned into triumph. If they were going to attack, they had to attack together. He immediately gave the order that everyone had been waiting for so long. He ordered the same signal to be sounded, 6 trumpet blasts. But now it was not a signal for a planned attack, but a signal to support the one that had already begun. He turned an act of disobedience into a coordinated counterattack. Richard himself led the center of his army. The knights, who had been languishing for weeks in anticipation, roared as they descended upon the enemy. French knights, English knights, Templars from the vanguard, the entire army, like a single steel fist, struck Saladin's disorganized ranks. Richard's plan collapsed. Chaos ensued. Was this the end of the crusade? In the next chapter, you will learn how genius turns disaster into triumph. Richard's decision to support the premature attack by the Hospitallers was pure improvisation, but it was a stroke of genius. He instantly assessed the changed situation and realized that the only way to save the day was to increase the chaos, but to his advantage. The signal of the trumpets was heard across the entire front line. What followed has gone down in military history textbooks. The heavy knightly cavalry of the Crusaders, which they had held back for weeks, was finally unleashed. It was not just an attack, it was an eruption of pent-up fury. Thousands of warriors in heavy armor, on powerful war horses, like a single wave of steel, crashed into Saladin's army. The effect was stunning. Saladin's warriors, mostly light cavalry and infantry, were not prepared for such a blow. Their entire tactic was based on stabbing and retreating. They were never meant to face a head-on collision with the armored battering ram of European knighthood. They were in the process of attacking, their ranks stretched out and mixed. When the Hospitallers struck their first blow, they broke through the first line of defense. But they were alone and could have been surrounded. However, the immediate support organized by Richard changed everything. Behind the Hospitallers, fresh forces rushed into the breach, widening it into a gaping hole in Saladin's entire front. Richard the Lionheart himself, as befits a warrior king, was at the very center of the battle. His presence inspired the warriors. They saw their leader fighting side by side with them, and this increased their strength tenfold. Chronicles describe how he raced across the battlefield, bringing order where it was needed and inspiring feats of valor. It was a perfect demonstration of the power of heavy cavalry. The light armor and mobile horses of Saladin's warriors gave them no advantage in close combat. The steel of European swords and spears pierced their defenses. The attack was so swift and powerful that Saladin's army simply did not have time to regroup or organize a counterattack. The Crusader infantry, crossbowmen, and spearmen also did their part. After the cavalry broke through the front lines, the infantry moved forward, securing the victory and preventing the enemy from regrouping. It was a coordinated effort by all branches of the army, perfectly orchestrated by Richard right in the middle of the battle. Saladin, watching from the hill, was shocked. His army, which had been victorious just a minute ago, was now fleeing. Richard's plan, which seemed to have failed because of the Hospitallers, ultimately worked, albeit not as intended. The restrained spring straightened with such force that it swept away everything in its path. This attack revealed a fundamental difference in military doctrines. The East relied on maneuver, cunning, and shooting. The West relied on heavy armor, discipline, and the crushing blow of the steel fist. And on that day in the fields near Arsuf, the steel fist proved to be stronger. Richard's counterattack turned the battlefield into a boiling cauldron. It was not maneuvering, but a direct, violent clash. Heavy knights, each of whom was essentially a walking fortress, cut into the enemy ranks. The clang of steel filled the air. It was the type of battle that Saladin had so wanted to avoid, and that the knights had so craved. Saladin's personal guard, his most elite warriors, attempted to resist. They were brave and experienced fighters, but there were too few of them to stop the avalanche. They entered the fray, trying to give their sultan and the rest of the army time to retreat and regroup. This moment marked the climax of the battle. In one section of the field, the elite of the Islamic world and the elite of Christian knighthood clashed. It was not just a clash, it was a dispute over whose military philosophy was stronger. The knights, protected from head to toe, were almost invulnerable to light weapons, while their heavy swords inflicted terrible damage. Saladin himself was in the thick of the action. He desperately tried to gather his warriors, stop the panic, and organize a defense. He rode from unit to unit, urging them to stand their ground. But the panic had already begun. Seeing their comrades retreat, even the most steadfast warriors faltered. Richard, on the other hand, was in complete control of his army. After the first crushing blow, he did not allow his knights to get carried away with the pursuit. This was another trap they could fall into. If they got carried away with the chase, they could spread out, and Saladin could defeat them one by one. As soon as the first wave of the attack had subsided and the enemy had been repelled, Richard ordered a retreat. For the knights, intoxicated by their success, this was another shocking order. They wanted to pursue, but the king was adamant. The army returned to its positions in an orderly fashion, regrouped, and prepared for a possible counterattack by Saladin. This move demonstrated Richard's tactical maturity. He was not only a brave warrior, but also a calculating commander. He took everything he could from the attack. He broke the enemy, but did not risk his army for the sake of momentary glory. He had won the battle and was not going to lose the war because of excessive haste. Saladin's warriors, seeing that the Crusaders were not pursuing them, were able to retreat in relative order, but their fighting spirit was broken. For the first time in a long time, they had suffered defeat in open battle. The myth of Saladin's invincibility, which he had spent so long building up, was seriously undermined. The battlefield remained in Richard's hands. He demonstrated not only personal courage, but also incredible flexibility of mind, turning his subordinate's mistake into a brilliant victory. He outplayed Saladin on his own turf, withstanding psychological pressure and striking at the most opportune moment. When the dust settled, the full picture of what had happened became clear. Saladin's army was defeated and scattered. They retreated to the forest of Arsuf and then further, leaving the battlefield to the Crusaders. This was not just a tactical retreat, it was a rout. In Saladin's camp, captured by the Crusaders, rich trophies were found, including the Sultan's personal belongings. The victory was complete and unconditional. Richard the Lionheart defeated the legendary Saladin in his first major field battle in the Holy Land. The morale boost from this victory was enormous. The Crusaders, exhausted by their long march, regained their faith in themselves and their leader. Their fighting spirit soared to the heavens. For Saladin, however, this defeat was a heavy blow. His soldiers were demoralized. They saw that the heavy cavalry of the Franks was a force that could not be fought in open battle. The myth of the Sultan's invincibility was shattered, and this led to a decline in discipline in his multinational army. Immediately after the battle, Richard, true to his cautious strategy, did not pursue the enemy into the forests, where an ambush awaited him. He ordered the army to set up camp right on the battlefield, and the next day he continued his march to Jaffa. Now no one stood in his way. The path was open. Saladin, realizing that he could no longer stop Richard, resorted to a scorched earth policy. He ordered the destruction of the fortress of Jaffa so that it would not fall into the hands of the Crusaders. But Richard entered the city anyway and immediately began to rebuild it, turning it into his new stronghold on the coast. The Battle of Arsuf had far-reaching strategic consequences. First, Richard gained control of the entire coast from Acre to Jaffa. This ensured him uninterrupted supplies by sea and deprived Saladin of access to important ports. Second, it was a huge psychological victory. However, despite its brilliant tactical success, Arsuf was not a decisive victory in the war. The main goal, Jerusalem, was still far away. Richard understood that taking the city was one thing, but holding it deep in enemy territory was quite another. His army was too small for that. Nevertheless, Arsuf showed Saladin that he could not defeat this enemy by force. Richard was too good a commander, and his soldiers were too resilient. This defeat ultimately forced Saladin to negotiate. The battle went down in history as a classic example of the clash between mobility and armor, cunning and discipline. Richard demonstrated that European military thinking could adapt to the conditions of the East and prevail. The victory at Arsuf was a triumph of one man's will. Richard forced his army, consisting of proud and independent knights, to obey iron discipline. He taught them to wait, to endure, and to strike only on command. And although that command was ultimately violated, it was the restraint he instilled in them that allowed them to hold out and win. The Battle of Arsuf was a turning point in the Third Crusade. Although it did not lead to the immediate capture of Jerusalem, it radically changed the balance of power. Richard the Lionheart proved that Saladin could be defeated in open battle, something no one before him had been able to do. It was a powerful blow to the Sultan's prestige. The lesson Richard taught Saladin was simple. Do not underestimate your enemy and their ability to adapt. European knights were not just a crowd of steel-clad warriors thirsting for glory. Under competent leadership, they became a formidable, disciplined force capable of solving the most complex tactical problems. Saladin, being a wise ruler, learned this lesson. He never again engaged in open battle with Richard's army. He switched to defense and guerrilla warfare, realizing that he had no chance in a head-on confrontation. The Battle of Arsuf forced him to change his very philosophy of war. For Richard, this battle was also an important lesson. He saw that, despite all his willpower and iron discipline, the human factor, impulse, emotion, fatigue, could always interfere with even the most perfect plan. His genius lay in his ability to withstand the pressure of circumstances and use them to his advantage. Ultimately, the Third Crusade ended not with a military victory, but with a peace treaty. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed a year later, was a direct result of the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin, respecting Richard's strength, agreed to a compromise. The coast remained with the Crusaders, and Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed free access to the holy sites. It was a unique ending to a medieval war. The two great commanders, showing mutual respect, recognized that neither of them could achieve complete victory. Arsuf became the argument that forced them to sit down at the negotiating table. The story of this battle is not just a story of tactics and strategy. It is a story of human endurance, strength of spirit, and how two leaders, despite being irreconcilable enemies, were able to maintain respect for each other. Richard and Saladin became legends not only as great warriors, but also as models of chivalrous behavior. The Battle of Arsuf showed that war is not only a clash of armies, but also a duel of minds. Richard won this duel by forcing his opponent to play by his rules. He turned his army into a perfect instrument that withstood the test of fire, water, and steel on the scorched coast of the Holy Land. This march and this battle demonstrated the pinnacle of medieval military art. A combination of logistics, discipline, technology, and flexible tactical thinking is what brought Richard victory at Arsuf. The legacy of this battle has lived on for centuries. It is studied in military academies as an example of a brilliantly executed operation under the most difficult conditions. And the names of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin have gone down in history as symbols of an entire era, the era of the Crusades. We conclude our immersion in one of the most iconic battles of the Middle Ages. The Battle of Arsuf is not just a story about the clash of two armies. It is a lesson in strategy, psychology, and iron discipline. Richard the Lionheart proved that sometimes restraint and patience are more formidable weapons than the most furious attack. Saladin, in turn, learned a hard lesson about the strength of an enemy he had learned to respect. The stories of great battles are endless. Which battle would you like to hear about next? Perhaps the Battle of Cannae, the Battle of Hastings, or the Siege of Constantinople. Write your suggestions in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new chapters from the great book of military history.